Greetings again. We are going to continue looking at the Trinity, and this is lesson 3. Last time we looked at sort of the orthodox definition of the Trinity and looked at the aspects that God is 3 persons. Each person is fully God, and yet there is only one God. So it is, again, a very challenging doctrine to deal with. And today what we're going to be doing is we're going to look at what you would call errant views. And some of them are errant in people just don't understand what the Scripture is taking. Some are errant because they actually create true error. A lot of cults like to mess with some of these views to create all sorts of errant understandings that lead to other doctrinal issues. But basically what we want to do is understand why some of these, and I'm not going to ascribe evil motives, though there are certainly people that have those. We want to look and see how easy it is to fall into error and what those errors look like and some of the ramifications of them. So again, most of this lesson is following along with Dr. Grudem's systematic theology. We've edited it. But on the board behind me here is a diagram that James White has in his book that sort of says, here's what, if you deny certain aspects, what are the consequences of it? And so let me just take a real quick second and sort of point these things out. First off, there's one God. Denial, if you deny monotheism, what are you going to end up? It's going to lead to polytheism. So in other words, if you say, well, there's not just one God, okay, there's the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are actually 3 gods, what that ends up in is polytheism. Now, if you deny the equality of God, in other words, all 3 persons are fully God or fully deity, this leads to what's called subordination. In other words, there may be deity in the Father, but then the Son and the Spirit are lesser. Now, we're not talking about roles and hierarchy and structure, because we will see that in the economic Trinity, in other words, how the persons of the Trinity interrelate. So we're not talking about that. This is like true inferiority versus role. And then there's the third area is the denial of the 3 persons. In other words, denying that God is actually 3 persons. What does that lead to? That leads to what is called modalism or Sabellianism we're going to talk about. And that's the first topic that we're going to address. We're going to come back and look at all of these different areas. So first one we're going to look at is the denial that God is 3 persons. And like I said, how do you come up with that? Well, we're trying to protect monotheism. We're trying to say, okay, God is one God, so there can't be 3 persons. Because again, in our minds, one being can't be 3 persons because we can't see anything beyond that. Again, God is far beyond us. So what modalism claims is that there is one person or one God that appears to us in different forms or modes. Like I said, here's an example of how people would look at it. They say, in the Old Testament, God appears to us as Father. In the New Testament and during life and human ministry, the divine person, the God, appears, instead of Father, appears as the Son. And then after Pentecost, the Spirit is the appearance of God. So in other words, 3 modes. God is God, and He appears as the Father in the Old Testament. He appears as the Son in the New Testament, and appears as the Spirit, Pentecost. So in other words, modes of operation, not 3 persons. So again, this is a denial of the 3-personness. And from a historical perspective, at least the first major recording of this type of thinking, and again, the Trinitarian doctrines were being developed, was a teacher in the 3rd century, or the 200s, named Sabellius. And that's where you get the idea of Sabellianism. You'll hear that in systematic theologies in talking about this. There's also sometimes you'll hear the expression or term modalistic monarchianism. In other words, the modes of the monarch, because that comes to the idea that there's one ruler of the universe, God, and that monarch, that ruler, appears as in 3 modes. And so you also sometimes you hear dynamic instead of modalistic. In other words, change. a dynamic change in how he appears. So again, that's different modes of operation of the same person. In other words, not three persons, one person, different modes. Again, the idea behind this is there is monotheism. There's one God. Well, how can you have three persons, one God? That's the dichotomy. And the question is there any biblical support for this? And so do they just pull this out of the air, or is there some biblical support that you might read and go, well, maybe that's what's really happening. Maybe I should think about this. And there are a couple of passages, to be honest, that if you just flatly read them, you might go, maybe we don't get it right. Again, when you pull one passage out of the context of the larger passages, this is where you get yourself into trouble. And here's a couple of them that you could get yourself into trouble on. John 10:30. John 10:30, Jesus says, I and the Father are one. You might read that and go, oh, well, we're the same. We're one. So what you think I am and what you think Father is just two manifestations, two modes. So we're one. Another passage out of John 14:9, when Jesus says, he who has seen me has seen the Father. Okay. Well, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Oh, that means whatever you see, it's just a different mode. And so you could go, okay, well, maybe there's something to it. But if you really think about this, and we've talked about this, when you put it in the bigger context, the John 10 passage, John 10:30, I and the Father are one, probably from the context would be better understood that Jesus and the Father are affirming to be of one purpose, one mind, one goal. And what was in the context was to save all of whom the Father has given him. It's kind of like if you think about it in parenting. If you say to your kids, your mom and I are one on this one. We're in the same team because this is what I want, this is what she wants. So I got my part and she's got her part. And the Father, in this context, when Jesus says, I and the Father are one, that is far more likely in the context of what is the meaning. Though you could pull it out of its context and say, see, they're the same. But that's not the better answer. We also realize that he who has seen me has seen the Father, and that in the John 14:9, and that passage is far, far, far more likely to simply mean that Jesus is revealing of the full character of who God is. The writer of Hebrews talks about that, and John also talks about he has explained him. In other words, Jesus, the incarnate Son, has revealed and explained who God the Father is. In other words, not that they're one, the same, as in not two persons, but one in the same character, essence, being. So even though there are some passages that you could lean on and say, okay, well, that's why they get this, more often it's just people trying to wrestle with a very difficult doctrine and not coming to a good conclusion by looking at all of the evidence in the Scriptures. And that's why we go back. We don't just make these things up. We go back to the Bible and say, what does it actually say about who God is? And sometimes it's hard for us to understand, but then again, God is God. So what are the consequences? Are there consequences to this? If you just look at it and say, well, okay, as long as they realize the Father, the Son, the Spirit, does it really matter? Well, it does kind of. And so let's look at a couple of these things. And there's some really serious things that come out of this. And the first off, there's pretty fatal shortcoming of this idea is that it requires us to deny the personal relationships within the Trinity. In other words, what you're seeing is just apparent. There is no personal relationship. There is no Father loving the Son. There is no intercession. There is none of this stuff. There's no interpersonal anything. It's just it's kind of a fake. It's kind of an illusion at best, and a complete denial of what the Scriptures are saying. And it also has to deny the baptism of Jesus, that the Father speaking from heaven, the Spirit's descending like a dove on Jesus. And if Jesus is praying to the Father, that's just an illusion. And if the Son or the Spirit are interceding on behalf of the saints for the Father, that's kind of like, this is all just made up. Why would you even say such a thing? Why would we have any of that explanation? Just say, I'm God, I'm God, I'm God, I'm God, I'll be there. Why intercede? Why speak? Why do any of those things? So it really kind of takes out all of those interpersonal relationships, and yet we see all of those described in the Scriptures. Now, here's where you get into even another kind of a really sticky thing, is it ultimately loses the heart of the doctrine of the atonement. All right? So this is the idea that God has sent His Son as the substitutionary sacrifice, and that the Son bears the wrath of God in the place of sinners, and that the Father represents the interests of the Trinity. He saw the suffering and was satisfied. Isaiah 53. The whole idea here is that the atonement is kind of a farce. Hi, I'm satisfied with what I did when I'm being involved in it, but I'm not really. Again, all the description just doesn't make any sense. And so basically you end up with the idea that personal relationships aren't real, even though they're described, and the doctrine of atonement isn't really real, because how can God be satisfied with the wrath pouring out on Himself unless there's three persons? And this is something that is pretty tough. There's one final idea, and again, it's not something you can just jump in and prove, but you certainly can infer from it, is this idea denies the independence of God. And we have was it TH215, I think it is, the attributes of God, looking at the characteristics of who God is from the Scriptures. And one of those characteristics is independence. And if God is the only one person, okay, only one person, only one being, only one God, is modalistic in these other realms, you realize that God has no ability to communicate, to love, or to interact outside of having something that He has to create to interact with, because He's alone. We talked about the love relationship between the Father and the Son and the Spirit and all those different dynamics. Basically, God is kind of in stasis unless He creates, because there is no interaction. There's no other being to interact with. So it's kind of like God's dependent on you to be able to be who He is. It's kind of a strange thing. So again, you can look at other places. I think in Gruden's book, I think it's chapter 12 on God's independence, or something like that. So now, is there many people who hold to these modalistic views today? Well, there are some people, and I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but I mean, if it's your doctrine, it's your doctrine. Some of the, I think it's the United Pentecostal Church, and forgive me if you're United Pentecostal and this isn't exactly how you believe, but as a general doctrine, modalism is talked about. And there's some popular preachers who hold to this kind of idea today. And instead of referring to persons of the Trinity, they prefer it's typically also referred to as a oneness Pentecostal folks, because that's the oneness, God is just one. Instead of using the word persons, they use the word manifestation. So as soon as you start seeing the Trinity talked about as a manifestation, you're really using the word modalism. That's the theologic term. If God is just appearing in a manifestation versus a person of the Trinity, now you are going to be in this modalistic thinking. And as some in this oneness movement puts forth, it says, we have one God, but He is the Father in creation, Son in redemption, and Spirit in regeneration. So again, these are doctrines, and that basically what that does is it says it denies the three persons. That leads to modalism, and that's what we see in here. Next, we're going to look at denials that each person is fully God.